Hey, I'm Nathan. Before we start, I want you to think about something most people never think about at all. Right now, on the outside wall of the building you're sitting in, there's a meter. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't take sides. It just counts. Every time a pump kicks on, every time a dryer cycles, every time somebody opens a walk-in cooler at 3 in the morning, that meter writes it down in a language almost nobody bothers to learn. Today's story is about a man who learned it. His name is Judah Kirkland, and he spent 30 years reading the electrical fingerprint of buildings the way a doctor reads a chart. He never expected that skill to be the thing that saved his son's life. Here's what I love about this one. It isn't a story about a father who went in swinging. It's a story about a father who understood something the people who took his son did not, that a building can't lie for you. It draws what it draws, and if you keep a careful enough record, a house will eventually testify against the people living in it. Stay with me to the end, because the way this man finally opened a locked door is one of the most patient, most beautifully legal things I've ever put on this channel. Let's get into it. Judah Kirkland had a rule about houses, and he'd been saying it out loud for so long that his son used to mouth it along with him from the passenger seat. Every house keeps a diary. It's written in amps. He'd learned it in the Navy, in the machinery spaces of a boat that ran on a reactor, where you didn't get to look at a system so much as listen to what it pulled. A pump that was starting to fail drew a little more. A bearing going bad sang in the current before it ever sang in the air. By the time Judah was 24, he could stand at a panel with a clamp meter and tell you what was running 2 decks down without seeing any of it. He got out at 31, came home to Haverlock, New York, and turned that into a living. Kirkland Load and Meter, industrial submetering, power quality forensics, energy audits for the kind of clients who couldn't figure out why their bill had doubled. It was unglamorous work, and he was very good at it. Hospitals called him. A cheese plant called him. A ski area called him twice. Haverlock sat up in the hill country where the dairies used to be, and most of the dairies weren't anymore. Barns leaned. Silos stood in fields like chimneys of houses that had burned. It was a place that had spent 40 years quietly losing, and Judah liked it anyway, because it was honest about it. He'd buried his wife Constance 6 years earlier. ALS took her in 19 months, which everybody told him was mercifully fast, and which he privately thought was one of the stupidest sentences in the English language. What he had left of her was a son. Lucas Kirkland was 24 and had his mother's calm and his father's hands. He'd gone to the trade school in Oneonta, then apprenticed under Judah, and he was 2 years from his journeyman card. He was the kind of young man who wrote things down. He labeled every circuit he touched. He kept a little notebook in the leg pocket of his work pants and drew panel schedules in it in tiny, square capitals. Judah used to tease him about it. Lucas would say, without looking up, that a man who writes it down doesn't have to remember it. 19 months before any of this, Lucas married Serena Bellinger. Judah had liked her at first, and he was honest enough later to admit that. Serena was 27, warm in a practiced way, and she laughed at exactly the right moment, every time. It took Judah about 8 months to notice that this was a skill and not a temperament. The Bellingers were the closest thing Haverlock had to gentry, and they'd gotten there recently. For 4 generations they'd run Bellinger & Sons Creamery on 400 acres out on the Harrowgate Road, and like everyone else they'd been beaten by milk prices in the 90s. But where the other families sold out, Ellsworth Bellinger did something clever. He kept the land, gutted the creamery, and reopened it as a residential wellness retreat. Harrowgate, they called it. 38 private rooms in what had been the milk house and the old dormitory for hired men. Stone walls, good windows, a reflecting pond where the manure lagoon used to be. Brochures with a lot of white space. Rates that made Judah whistle. Ellsworth was 66, a big soft-spoken man who'd been the county extension agent for 11 years before he'd been anything else. And he had the extension agent's gift of making you feel like the two of you were solving something together. His wife Bernadine kept the books and the guest ledger, and had a way of looking at you like she was reading a label. Their son Carson, 38, ran what the brochure called the outdoor program. Their daughter Corabelle was a nurse and signed the intake forms. Serena was the youngest, and she did admissions. The wedding was at Harrowgate, under a tent by the pond. Judah gave a short toast about his wife and about how you can tell everything about a person by what they do when nobody's grading them. Ellsworth shook his hand afterward and held it a second too long and said, "We take care of our own out here, Mr. Kirkland." Judah remembered later that it hadn't sounded like a welcome. Then, that autumn, Harrowgate hired Kirkland Load and Meter. It was a good job, and Judah took it gladly. The compound's electrical service was a disaster. 100 years of farm wiring with a wellness retreat bolted on top, and their bills were catastrophic. Ellsworth wanted to know why. Judah told him he'd know in 90 days. The way Judah worked was this. He didn't guess. He installed his own monitoring hardware at the service entrance and on every subpanel that mattered. Small cellular loggers that sampled current 60 times a second and pushed the data to his server. Then, he let the building talk for a season. Winter loads, spring loads, the whole cycle. After 90 days, he'd hand a client a report that told them things about their own property they hadn't known in 20 years. He put 11 loggers in at Harrowgate. Main service, kitchen, laundry, the shop, the pump house, the lodge, and 4 on the old creamery wing, because the creamery wing was strange and he wanted to see it. The creamery wing was strange for reasons he couldn't name at first. It had its own subpanel, which was fine. It had a dedicated well pump circuit, which was odd. It had a 100-amp feed to a wing the brochure described as storage, which was not fine at all. And it had a card reader on the corridor door, which Judah noticed and filed away, and did not think about again for 4 months, because he was a contractor and not a suspicious man. Lucas did the rough-in on the creamery wing. That was the arrangement. Judah did the metering, and his son and 1 helper pulled the new circuits and cleaned up the mess a century of farmers had made in those walls. Lucas worked out there through October and November. He liked it, mostly. He liked that his wife's family had given him the work, and he was young enough to be flattered by it. He came home with his notebook full of tiny square capitals. The first time Judah heard something in his son's voice that he didn't like was the 2nd week of November. They were eating at the shop, sitting on upturned buckets with the door open to the cold because Judah always did that. Lucas said out of nothing that the doors in the creamery corridor were hung backwards. Judah asked what he meant. Lucas said the maglocks were wired to hold when the power dropped, not release. Hold. Judah put down his sandwich. He said, "That's not legal." "I know," Lucas said. "That's what I said." "And what did they say?" Lucas turned his coffee around in his hands a couple of times. He said, "Carson told me the storage wing has a lot of value in it, and it's not my problem how they secure their own property." Judah thought about it for a while. Then he told his son that when they finished the job he'd write it up in the report, because that's what a report was for, and that in the meantime Lucas shouldn't argue about it with a man twice his size in a building with no witnesses. He meant it as a joke. Lucas laughed. Judah has replayed that laugh more times than he can count. In December, Lucas started missing Sunday dinners. Judah didn't panic, because there was nothing yet to panic about. His son was married 19 months and living out at the compound in the old foreman's house, and married men miss Sunday dinners. That's not a mystery, that's just a Sunday. The first one, Serena called ahead. Lucas was under the weather. She was bright about it and asked after Judah's knee. The second one, nobody called at all, and when Judah called the house it went to voicemail in a way that made him think somebody had looked at the screen and made a decision. The third one, Serena picked up on the 6th ring and said Lucas had been having a hard stretch. Judah asked what that meant. She said, "He's been drinking, Judah. I didn't want to be the one to tell you." That landed. It landed exactly where she'd aimed it, because Judah's own father had been a drinker, and Serena knew that, because Judah had told her at Thanksgiving with his guard down. It's an ugly thing to look back on. He gave her a piece of himself and she filed it. He said he'd like to talk to his son. She said Lucas was asleep. He said he'd come out. She said honestly, that might make it worse right now. He didn't go out. That was the 28th of December, and for the rest of his life Judah Kirkland has been able to tell you exactly what he was doing at 9:40 at night on the 28th of December, which was standing in his kitchen letting a 27-year-old woman talk him out of driving 11 miles. On the 9th of January, Serena called him. He remembered the number of days between because he counted them later, in a hospital hallway, with his hands shaking. She said, "We've decided he's going to do a wellness stay." Judah asked her to say that again. She said Harrowgate had a program, that it was residential, that it was voluntary, that Lucas had signed the paperwork himself, and that Corabelle had countersigned as the clinical staff. She said the whole point was a clean break from everything outside. No phone, no visits, 30 days minimum. She said it like she was describing a spa. Judah said, "I'm his father." Serena said, "I know." And she paused for the exact right amount of time and then said, "Judah, he asked us not to tell you. He's ashamed." He hung up the phone and stood in his shop with the lights off and let himself feel like a failure for about 6 minutes. Then he went and got a legal pad. The thing about Judah Kirkland is that he wasn't a suspicious man, but he was a documenting one. 30 years of proving to clients that their bill was their own fault had made him incapable of believing anything he hadn't measured. So on the 9th of January, he wrote down the date, the time, the exact words, and the name of the person who'd said them. He did that every time after, for 51 days. He tried the polite roads first, and every one of them was paved for him. He drove out on the 12th. The gate at Harrowgate was closed, which it had never been. Ellsworth came down the drive in a coat and stood on the other side of it with his breath showing and said all the right things in the right order. That he loved that boy. That 30 days was nothing. That Judah, of all people, knew a man had to want it himself. Judah asked to see him for 5 minutes. Ellsworth said, and this is the sentence Judah kept, "We've found that family contact in the first phase resets the clock." He called Corabelle at the clinic in town. She was polite and rehearsed and used the phrase clinical discretion 4 times in 9 minutes. He called the sheriff's office and asked for a welfare check. 2 days later, a deputy named Anneke Rule called him back and said she'd gone out. She'd spoken with the staff, and she'd been told the resident declined visitors. Judah asked if she'd laid eyes on his son. There was a silence on the line that he understood better a month later. She said no, and that she was sorry, and that her sergeant had told her it was a civil matter. He called Sheriff Ordell Grimsley directly. Grimsley called him son, which is a hell of a thing to call a 52-year-old man, and told him that the Bellingers had done more for this county than anybody, and that a young man getting his life together wasn't a police problem. He called a lawyer in Delhi who said that an adult who signs a voluntary admission has, unfortunately, signed a voluntary admission. By the first week of February, Judah had run out of doors to knock on, and he was in the worst place a father can be, which is not despair, it's doubt. He genuinely did not know whether his son was drying out in a warm room or something else entirely, and every institution he'd been raised to trust had looked him in the face and told him it was the first one. So he did the only thing he had left, which was the thing he was actually good at. On the 6th of February, Judah opened his laptop, logged into his own monitoring server, and pulled up Harrowgate. The loggers were still there. Nobody had touched them, because nobody at Harrowgate thought of them as anything but boxes on a wall that made the bill go down. The 90-day study had ended in December, and the invoice had been paid. But Judah had never gone out to decommission the hardware, because it was February, and the road was bad, and there was no hurry. 11 loggers, sampling 60 times a second, uploading every 15 minutes over cellular. They had been running the entire time his son had been inside that building. Judah looked at that screen for a long while without touching anything. Then, because he was still trying to be a reasonable man, he did not go looking for evidence. He went looking for reassurance. He told himself he'd check the creamery wing, see a nice quiet residential load, 12 rooms of people sleeping, and go to bed. What he saw instead was the well pump on the creamery circuit running for 11 minutes at 2:40 in the morning, and again at 3:10, and again at 4. Every night, for a month. He sat back in his chair. Nobody showers at 4 in the morning. Not 12 people. Not every night. That's not a residence. That's a schedule. Judah Kirkland did not sleep that night, and he did not call anyone. And by 6 in the morning he had 4 weeks of data open in 8 windows and a legal pad going gray with pencil. Then, at 7 minutes past 2 on the morning of the 28th of February, his phone lit up on the nightstand with a number he didn't know. "Dad, I can't do this anymore. Come quietly and take me to safety." And then, 40 seconds later, a second message, and Judah read it standing in the dark in his socks, with his heart going like a hammer. "Don't call the house. Don't call the sheriff. Come to the creamery door, the one by the loading dock. I have about 4 minutes." He did not text back. He did not call. He was dressed in 90 seconds and out the door in 2 minutes, and he took the truck, and he did not turn on the radio. 11 miles of hill road at 2 in the morning in late February. There was old snow in the ditches and a skin of ice over everything, and Judah drove it faster than he should have and slower than he wanted to, because the one thing his son had asked for was quiet, and he was going to give him that if it killed him. He killed the headlights at the bottom of the Harrowgate Drive and rolled up the last 300 yards on the parking lights. He left the truck at the turnaround by the equipment shed. He walked. There was a light on in the main lodge. There was a light on over the porch. And standing on that porch, in a canvas coat, with his hands in his pockets like a man waiting for a delivery, was Ellsworth Bellinger. Judah stopped about 15 feet away. Ellsworth said, "It's late, Judah." Judah said, "I've come for my son." And Ellsworth Bellinger said the sentence that Judah Kirkland would still be able to hear, word for word, tone for tone, a year and a half later in a federal courtroom. He said, "He's our problem now, not yours." There was a moment there. Judah has been asked about it a lot since, and he always says the same thing, which is that he wasn't angry in that moment. Anger came later and stayed a while. What he felt on that gravel was something much colder and much more useful. He felt the click of a system, going from one state to another. He felt every polite road he'd walked down for 51 days close behind him at once. He said, "Step aside, El." Ellsworth came down off the step. He was a big man, and he'd been a big man his whole life, and he'd never once had to find out whether that meant anything. Judah walked through him. It wasn't a fight. He'd tell you that himself, and the security footage that later became Government Exhibit 14 backs him up. Judah took the hand that came at his chest, turned it in a way he'd learned a long time ago from a chief who'd been an amateur wrestler, and put Ellsworth Bellinger down on the frozen gravel on his side. Then he stepped over him and kept walking and did not look back, and the whole thing took less than 4 seconds. The creamery corridor door was propped with a folded shop rag. Judah has never found out for certain who put it there, though he has an idea, and her name is Tanzy. Inside, the corridor was cold. Not unheated building cold, cold like outside. But there were 8 doors on the left and 4 on the right, and every one had a card reader, and the third one on the left was open 2 inches. He said his son's name once, quietly. Lucas said, "Dad." Judah Kirkland has spent his whole working life in rooms he'd rather not be in. He'd pulled a man out of a burning switchgear room in 1996. He'd been at his wife's bed for the last 4 hours of her life. He'd tell you that nothing in 52 years had prepared him for opening that door. The room was maybe 9 by 11. There was a mattress on a steel frame, no sheet. There was a bucket. There was a window that had been closed off from the outside with plywood, so the only light was the corridors. There was a baseboard heater along the wall that Judah's own son had wired, and Judah put his hand on it later and found it cold, and found the breaker in the panel switched off, and that breaker being off became one of the most important facts in the case. Lucas was sitting on the edge of the mattress with a blanket over his shoulders, and he was 51 days into a room, and Judah could count his ribs through a t-shirt. But it wasn't that. Judah will tell you it wasn't the weight, and it wasn't the smell, and it wasn't the bucket. It was his hands. Lucas held them up, a little, the way you do when you want somebody to see something and you're ashamed of it at the same time. And in the corridor light, his father saw that the fingertips of both hands had been sanded down. Not cut. Sanded, the way you'd take the varnish off a chair, until the ridges were gone and the skin was a smooth, shining red. The nails on both index fingers were gone. There was a rime of dried lye burn across the backs of both hands and up both forearms, cracked and weeping at the knuckles. The right wrist sat wrong, a knot of bone under the skin where something had broken in January and healed however it wanted to. Judah asked, very quietly, "Who did this?" And Lucas said the thing that made his father understand that this was not cruelty. It was engineering. He said, "They said a phone won't know me anymore." He got his son out of that room the same way he'd come in, quietly, one arm under his shoulders, and Lucas weighed almost nothing. There was a light on now in the lodge, and another coming on upstairs. Somewhere behind them, a woman's voice said a name. Judah did not stop and did not answer, and put Lucas in the passenger seat of the truck, and buckled him in like a child, because Lucas could not work the buckle. Ellsworth was on his feet by then, at the top of the drive, not coming any closer, just standing there watching the truck turn around. He shouted something. Judah has never been able to remember what it was, which he thinks is his brain doing him a kindness. He drove to Bassett in Cooperstown, 50 minutes, because Haverlock's clinic was Corabelle Bellinger's clinic, and Judah was done being reasonable about who he trusted. The emergency doctor was a woman named Alina Petrosian, and Judah will be grateful to her until the day he dies. She took one look at Lucas's hands, and one look at his weight, and one look at his father, and she did not ask a single soft question. She said, "I'm going to photograph everything, and I'm going to call this in, and you're both going to stay right here." Lucas weighed 126 pounds. He had been 171 at Thanksgiving. Petrosian found and documented in the order she found them bilateral partial thickness chemical burns to the dorsum of both hands and both forearms, consistent with repeated immersion in a strong alkali, at multiple ages, meaning it had happened again and again over weeks. Abrasion of the volar pads of all 10 digits down through the dermal ridge, healing at different rates, meaning that had happened repeatedly too. Loss of both index fingernails, a malunited scaphoid fracture of the right wrist, 6 to 8 weeks old, never immobilized. Circumferential ligature scarring at both wrists, thin and clean, consistent with plastic restraints, at least 11 distinct events. Refeeding risk malnutrition, 2 cracked ribs, healed, and on the soles of both feet, a pattern of small healed punctures that took her 20 minutes to place, until Lucas told her, and then she left the room for a moment and came back with her jaw set. "The gravel," Lucas said. "You do the drive barefoot. That's a work item." Judah stood in that hallway at 5 in the morning, and his hands started shaking, and they did not stop for 3 days. Not tremors from adrenaline. A steady, fine shake all the way through the weekend, so bad that he could not hold a coffee cup with one hand and could not sign the hospital paperwork on the first try. He is not a man who cries much, and he did not cry. He just shook, for 72 hours, like a building with a bad ground. At 6:40 in the morning, a deputy came, and it was Annika Rule. She looked at Lucas's hands for a long time. Then she went out to the parking lot, and Judah followed her, and she stood by her cruiser with her hat in her hand and said, "Mr. Kirkland, I went out there on the 14th of January. I stood in the lodge. They told me he was in session. I asked to see him, and Mrs. Bellinger said that would be a HIPAA problem, and I didn't know if that was true or not. So I wrote what I was told and I left. And she said, I have thought about that morning every day since, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think my sergeant is going to want this report." Judah asked her a question that he says now was the smartest thing he did in the whole business. He asked her, "If you write it, where does it go?" She said, "It goes into the county system, where the sheriff reads everything." He said, "Then don't write it yet." Because here is what Judah Kirkland understood, sitting in that parking lot with his hands shaking, that a lot of fathers in that position never understand. He had exactly one advantage, and it was that the Bellingers did not yet know how badly they were caught. The second a report hit the county system, Harrowgate would be scrubbed. The plywood would come off the windows. The card readers would come off the doors. The bucket would go in a dumpster. And the 11 boxes on the walls that nobody had ever thought about would come down. Sheriff Grimsley called Judah at 9 that morning, and he was not friendly anymore. He said there was a complaint of a burglary and an assault out at Harrowgate, that Ellsworth Bellinger had a fractured elbow, and that Judah should come in and get ahead of it. Judah said, "I'll bring my son. He'll want to make a statement too." There was a pause on that line that told him everything about how the next 6 months were going to go. He did not go in. He called a lawyer in Albany named Georgina Yancey instead, on Dr. Petrosian's recommendation, and Yancey listened for 19 minutes and then said a sentence that reorganized Judah's whole life. She said, "Mr. Kirkland, stop thinking of this as an assault, because it isn't one. What you're describing is forced labor and involuntary servitude, and that is a federal crime, and your sheriff is not involved in it in any way that matters." Lucas talked on the 4th day. He had not been able to before, not because of injury. Because of a thing Dr. Petrosian explained to Judah in the hallway, that 51 days of a place where speaking got you a consequence will teach an intelligent young man not to speak, very fast, and that it comes back slowly. What he said, over about 6 hours, in pieces, with his father writing it down on a legal pad because Lucas asked him to, was this: In the last week of November, finishing the rough-in above the corridor ceiling in the creamery wing, Lucas had found a bundle of low-voltage cable that wasn't on any drawing he'd been given. He followed it, because he was the kind of young man who followed things. It ran from the card readers on the 12 corridor doors to a small networked controller in a locked closet, and that controller had a log. He was in that ceiling for 40 minutes, with a flashlight in his teeth, and what he saw on the little screen was door open and door close events going back 3 years. Not 12 rooms of guests. Rooms that opened 4 times a day, at mealtimes, and not otherwise, for months at a stretch. Room 6 had been opened on that pattern for 401 consecutive days. And while he was up there, he heard 2 people come into the corridor below him and stop, and one of them was his wife. Lucas did not tell his father, for a while, what he heard. It took him until the 5th day. What he heard was Serena and a man he did not know at that point, and they were not discussing business. They were discussing where to spend a weekend in March, and how much longer this had to go on, and the man said a sentence Lucas would repeat to a federal grand jury 14 months later. He said, "Give it till the spring, and then we'll have the boy sign and be done with him." The man's name was Sebastian Whitcomb. He was 45, an attorney out of Binghamton, and his firm was called Whitcomb Reconciliation Counsel. And Judah had shaken his hand at the wedding and thought he was a cousin. Lucas went to Serena that night, in the foreman's house, and did the thing that a decent, straightforward 24-year-old does, which is the worst possible thing. He told her exactly what he'd found, and exactly what he'd heard, and exactly what he intended to do about it, which was to call the state. He was in room 3 on the creamery corridor by 4 the next afternoon. They had him sign the voluntary admission first, and Corabelle countersigned it, and Serena cried while he signed, and Lucas has said that the crying is the part he still can't think about. He signed because Carson was standing behind him, and because his wife told him it was 30 days, and then everything would be fine. Then the door closed and the card reader beeped, and the 30 days became 51. Judah listened to all of that with his hands shaking and his pencil going, and at the end of it he went out to the truck and sat in it in the hospital garage for 20 minutes. He'll tell you what he thought about. He thought about driving out there. He thought about it in detail, with a plan and a route and a sequence, because he was a systems man, and even his rage came organized. He had the tools. He had the access. He knew where every panel in that compound was, and he knew a dozen ways to make a building stop being a building. And then he thought about what that would actually buy. It would buy him a fire, and a headline, and a felony. And it would buy Ellsworth Bellinger, the single greatest gift you can give a man like that, which is a reason for people to feel sorry for him. It would put Judah in a cell, and it would leave whoever was in room 6 exactly where they were. He thought about a thing an old chief had told him in 1992, about how a flare is bright and short and shows everybody where you are, and a current is invisible and doesn't stop. He went back inside and told his son they were going to do this slowly, and that it was going to be worse to live through and better to win. Then he went home and opened the laptop. What Judah Kirkland did over the next 11 days, alone, at his kitchen table, is the reason this story ends the way it does. He read a building, understand what he actually had. 11 current loggers, sampling 60 times a second, on 11 different circuits at Harrowgate, running continuously from the 8th of October. 51 days of that overlapped precisely with his son's confinement. And electricity, unlike people, has no discretion at all. Every appliance has a signature. That's the whole trade. A resistive load like a water heater or a baseboard heater is a clean rectangle. It snaps on, holds a flat current, snaps off. A motor has an inrush spike 3 to 6 times its running current for a fraction of a second and then settles. A refrigeration compressor cycles on a duty pattern you can set a clock by. A commercial dryer has a motor plus a heating element, and the element modulates so it draws a shape like a comb. A pressure washer's pump loads and unloads every time somebody squeezes and releases the trigger, so on a graph it looks like a heartbeat. Judah didn't have cameras. He had something in some ways better, because a camera looks at one place and the meter watches everything at once, and nobody thinks to lie to it. Here is what the building told him. The creamery well pump ran 3 times a night, between 2:30 and 4:15, every night, in cycles of 9 to 12 minutes. It did not run at any other time. A hot water heater on the same sub-panel recovered immediately after each one, meaning it was hot water going somewhere. In volume, in the middle of the night, in a wing where 12 people were supposedly asleep. Lucas confirmed it later, and Judah already knew. They hosed the corridor, and the occupants at intervals through the night. That was the sleep program. The commercial dryer in the creamery laundry ran between 11 and 14 cycles a day, 7 days a week. Judah calculated the linen load of 12 rooms, and it should have been 3 cycles a day at most. 11 cycles is a dryer running to make heat and noise, or a dryer drying things that get soaked a great deal. The pressure washer on the shop circuit ran, on that heartbeat signature, between 6 and 9 in the morning, 6 days a week, for periods of 40 to 80 minutes, all winter. In January, in upstate New York, nobody pressure washes equipment outdoors at 7 in the morning in January. Somebody was making people do it. A 3-phase load in the old milk house, which Judah had originally logged as an unidentified compressor, turned out on inspection to be a rock crusher, a small one, the kind you'd use to make gravel out of the stone the Bellingers were pulling out of their own walls. It ran 4 to 6 hours a day. Lucas had operated it. So had 4 other people whose names Judah did not yet know. The kitchen load told him how many people were being fed and when, and the number did not match the guest ledger. And then there was the fact that broke it open, and Judah found it at 11 at night on the 4th of March, and sat completely still for a full minute afterward. He had installed a logger on the creamery baseboard heat circuit. 12 rooms, 12 heaters, all on one circuit, all resistive, all clean rectangles. Over the 51 days, that circuit drew almost exactly 11/12 of what a fully occupied wing should draw. One heater never came on. Not once. Through the coldest January in 9 years. He went back through the panel photos Lucas had taken during the rough-in, the ones his son had shot out of habit and uploaded to the company drive without thinking, and there in the picture was the creamery sub-panel, and there was a breaker with a piece of blue tape on it and, in Lucas's tiny square capitals, the number 3. And it was in the off position, and it had been in the off position in a photograph taken on the 19th of November, which was 8 days before Lucas Kirkland was put in room 3. They had turned the heat off in that room before they ever put him in it. That single fact, a breaker, in a photograph, with a date stamp, is the one Georgina Yancey later called the hinge of the entire prosecution, because it proved premeditation, and premeditation is the difference between a bad program and a conspiracy. Judah printed everything. Then he did something that surprised his lawyer. He got in the truck and drove to the utility. Delmar Skiles ran the metering department at the Rural Electric Cooperative in Haverlock, and he'd known Judah for 20 years and had never once bought him a beer, and they respected each other enormously. Judah put a folder on his desk and said, "Del, I need to know if my data's honest." Skiles didn't ask why. He pulled the co-op's own interval data for the Harrowgate service, the utility's revenue meter, 15-minute intervals, an entirely independent record, and laid it beside Judah's. They matched. Every peak, every night cycle, every morning pressure wash. 2 independent systems, 2 different owners, 1 story. Skiles took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes and said, "What is this, Judah?" Judah said, "It's a farm that stopped farming." The second thing Judah got, he did not go looking for. It came to him. On the 9th of March, there was a knock on the shop door at 4 in the afternoon, and standing in the cold was a 17-year-old girl in a barn coat, and it was Tanzy Bellinger, Carson's daughter, and she had a shoebox under her arm. She'd been the one who propped the door. She'd been the one who got the phone to Lucas, an old prepaid her grandmother had never known about, and she'd stood at the end of the corridor for those 4 minutes with her heart coming apart. She was Lucas's niece by marriage, and she'd liked him, and she had spent 3 years knowing something and being 17 about it. In the shoebox were 140 photographs, printed at a drugstore in Delhi over 2 years, so that nothing lived on a phone, and a spiral notebook. The photographs were of the corridor, of the work line at 6 in the morning, of a woman in room 6 in the doorway with a food tray, and Tanzy had written on the back, in pen, a date, and the words she says her name is Margot. The notebook was a list, dates, first names, room numbers, and a column Tanzy had titled Who's Paying. There were 19 names in it over 3 years. Judah looked at that notebook for a long time, And then he understood what he was actually dealing with. And it was not a family that had lost its mind. It was a business. Harrowgate's residential wellness program was real, and it had real clients, and it made real money, and it was the cover crop. The actual harvest was the creamery wing. What Ellsworth Bellinger had built, and what Sebastian Whitcomb sold, was a place where a wealthy family could put a person who was being inconvenient, an heir who wouldn't sign, a wife who wouldn't settle quietly, a partner who wanted to talk to a regulator, and get them back, some weeks later, agreeable. Whitcomb called it, in his own emails, pre-litigation reconciliation. He had a rate card, $12,000 a month, 60-day minimum, and a bonus on execution of the target document. The woman in room 6 was Margot Tetlow, 41, whose husband Rutherford had wanted a very quiet divorce and had not wanted to divide a company. She had been in that corridor for 401 days. There was a 29-year-old named Beau Trevino who had reported something at a poultry processor and whose employer's insurer had a relationship with Whitcomb. There was a 58-year-old named Winston Achebe. There was a 22-year-old named Sunday Vauclane who had been there 11 weeks and whose family had put her there themselves. And there was Lucas Kirkland, who was not a client at all, who had no rate card and no paying family, who was in there for free, because he had climbed into a ceiling with a flashlight in his teeth and looked at something he wasn't supposed to see. Tanzy stood in the shop with her hands in her coat pockets and said, "My dad's going to know it was me." Judah said, "Not for a while. And then, when he does, you're going to be somewhere else and I'm going to be standing in front of you." She said, "Mr. Kirkland, are you going to burn it down?" And Judah Kirkland, who had thought about exactly that for 3 days in early March, said no. He said, "I'm going to turn the lights on." Georgina Yancey did not take the case to the sheriff and she did not take it to the district attorney, because the district attorney in that county had been to 4 Bellinger fundraisers. She took it to Albany, to the FBI, to a squad that works civil rights and human trafficking, and it landed on the desk of a special agent named Rosalie Boudreau. Boudreau came out to the shop on the 17th of March in a rental car and sat on an upturned bucket, because that's what there was, and she read for 2 hours without saying much. At the end she said, "Mr. Kirkland, I want to be careful with you, because you have done something unusual, which is bring me a case that is almost finished." And then she told him the problem. The problem was the word voluntary. Every person in that corridor had signed an admission form. Every form was countersigned by a licensed nurse. Harrowgate's answer, the second anyone knocked, would be the same answer it had always been, and it was a good answer, and juries have believed worse ones. These are adults in a residential program. The doors are secured for their own safety. Nobody is a prisoner. Anyone may leave at any time. Judah said, "They can't leave. The locks hold when the power drops. My son told me in November." Boudreau said, "And that's a code violation, and it's evidence, and their lawyer will stand up and say the locks were installed by a contractor 20 years ago. Nobody understood the wiring, and it was a mistake." And she said the thing that shaped everything after. "I don't need to prove they were locked in. I need to prove they weren't free to go. Those aren't the same, and only one of them wins." Judah went home and thought about that for 2 days, and on the second night, at his kitchen table, he saw it. He did not need to break the locks. He needed to fix them, because if the doors in that corridor were made lawful, made to release on loss of power, exactly the way every fire code in the country requires, then everything Harrowgate said about itself became testable. If the doors opened by themselves and everyone stayed in their rooms, then the Bellingers were telling the truth, and Judah Kirkland was a bitter old man. And if the doors opened by themselves and 4 people walked out of that building at a dead run in front of witnesses, the word voluntary died on the spot and could never be resuscitated. The beauty of it, the thing Yancey still tells law students about, is that Judah did not have to do a single illegal thing to arrange it. He had to make 3 phone calls and then wait 7 weeks. The first call was to the office of the state fire marshal. A deputy state fire marshal named Bettina Krug took the complaint. Judah gave her the thing he actually had standing to give her. He had been the metering contractor of record at that property. He had a signed report on file, and in the course of his work his crew had documented 12 door assemblies in a residential occupancy, with electromagnetic locks wired to fail secure, with no fire alarm release, no interlock, and no manual egress hardware. He gave her the photographs Lucas had taken in November, with the timestamps intact. He gave her the panel schedule in tiny square capitals. He said nothing about his son. He said nothing about room 6. He made a code complaint, and he made it exactly, and he made it as boring as he possibly could. That was the entire trick. A criminal complaint would have gone into the county and out the other side to Ellsworth Bellinger inside a day. A fire code complaint went to Albany, into a queue, and came back out as a piece of state paper with no name on it. On the 2nd of April, Deputy Fire Marshal Krug inspected Harrowgate with 2 hours' notice, which is what the law allows her, and she was in that corridor for 40 minutes. She could not open the rooms. Corabell told her they were occupied and private, and Krug, who is a fire marshal and not a police officer, accepted that, because her jurisdiction is the building. She did not need the rooms. She wrote up the doors. The notice of violation ran to 4 pages, and it was, in its dull way, a masterpiece. 12 door assemblies in a Group R residential occupancy equipped with fail-secure electromagnetic locks. No connection to the fire alarm system. No approved manual release device on the egress side. No emergency lighting in the corridor. Correct within 45 days or the wing is ordered vacated pending re-inspection. Judah knew exactly what would happen next, because he knew exactly what kind of man Ellsworth Bellinger was. A man with something to hide does not fight a fire marshal. Fighting a fire marshal means hearings, means a re-inspection with the doors open, means a file with your name in it in Albany. A man with something to hide complies immediately, enthusiastically, and expensively, and then puts the certificate of correction in a frame. They hired a contractor out of Binghamton. On the 28th of April, that contractor pulled all 12 maglocks off their brackets, rewired the entire corridor to release on loss of power and on fire alarm, put a green push-to-exit button beside every door, and installed battery-backed emergency lighting the length of the hall. It cost the Bellingers $19,000, and it was inspected and signed off on the 6th of May by the county electrical inspector. Ellsworth Bellinger paid $19,000 to unlock every door in his own prison, and he did it because a woman with a clipboard told him to. The second call was to Delmar Skiles. Judah did not ask him for a favor, because he was not going to put a 20-year friendship or a man's pension inside this thing. He asked him a question, and it was a question any customer may ask. He asked whether the Harrowgate Road feeder was on the co-op's summer maintenance schedule. Skiles pulled it up. There were 2 poles on that circuit flagged for replacement, and a transformer that had been on the list for 3 years, and the work was going to happen sometime between May and September, whenever the crew got to it, and it would require a planned outage of roughly 2 hours. Judah asked one more question. He asked whether the co-op did that work at night on commercial feeders. Skiles said, usually, yes. Fewer complaints, that was all. Judah never asked for a date, and Skiles never gave him one. What Skiles did do, 6 weeks later, was exactly what the co-op does for every customer on a planned outage, which is mail a notice 30 days ahead and post it on the website. Harrowgate Road feeder, Thursday the 19th of June, outage window 2100 to 2300 hours. Judah did not need to arrange the date. He only needed to know it before they did anything about it. And there was one more thing he knew that they had forgotten, and it was in his own report, delivered in December, signed for by Ellsworth Bellinger. Page 11. Item 4. The automatic transfer switch on the standby generator was failed in the open position, would not sense a utility drop, and required replacement at an estimated cost of $8,400. Recommended immediately. They hadn't done it. Of course they hadn't done it. It didn't show up in a brochure, which meant that when the utility dropped, Harrowgate would go completely dark and stay dark until somebody walked out to the generator shed with a flashlight and started it by hand. Judah had timed that walk himself in October, out of professional curiosity, the way he timed everything. From the lodge to the shed and back was between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. The third call was to Rosalie Boudreau, and Judah laid the whole thing on the table and then sat back and let her tear it apart, which is what he wanted. She tore at it for an hour. Then she said, "All right, here's what I need from you, and it's going to be hard. I need you to do nothing." Because the one way to lose this was for Judah Kirkland's fingerprints to be anywhere near that night. If a defense attorney could put him in a truck within 5 miles of that property, every door that opened became a father's plot, instead of a building doing what the state of New York required it to do. So Judah stayed home. That was the price, and he paid it, and he says it was the hardest single thing in the whole affair. Tanzy Bellinger gave them the last piece in the second week of June, and it was the piece that made it a conspiracy instead of a family. 4 times a year, Harrowgate held what Ellsworth called the Founders' Table. It was dinner for 12 in the lodge's east room, no staff after the plates went down, and it was where Sebastian Whitcomb brought people, not patients, payers, families and their counsel, who came to look at the grounds and eat very good food and be told, in a room with no phones, what kinds of problems Harrowgate solved. The summer Founders' Table was on the calendar, in Bernadine Bellinger's handwriting, for Thursday the 19th of June, 7:30, and Tanzy photographed the page. Boudreau read that date and looked up and said, out loud, "You have got to be kidding me." The 19th of June was a hot, still Thursday, and at 7:30 in the evening, there were 19 people at Harrowgate who mattered. In the east room of the lodge, Ellsworth and Bernadine Bellinger, Carson, Corabelle, Sebastian Whitcomb, in a linen jacket holding the room, Serena Bellinger, seated beside him, wearing a dress Judah had never seen, and a wedding ring she had not taken off, because Whitcomb had told her it played better, and 6 guests, from 4 families, 2 of them with their attorneys. 200 yards away, in the creamery corridor, behind 12 doors that had cost $19,000 to make legal, Margot Tetlow, 481 days, Beau Trevino, 109, Winston Achebe, 62, Sunday Vauclane, 94, and 8 empty rooms, because business had been slow since February, since a young electrician's father had made a scene on the gravel, and Whitcomb had told them to keep the census light for a season. In the tree line along the old hedgerow on the north side of the property, since 4 that afternoon, 11 federal agents, a surveillance van, and Rosalie Boudreau, holding a search warrant signed that morning by a federal magistrate in Binghamton, and a second one for Whitcomb Reconciliation Council, and 11 arrest warrants she was not permitted to execute until she had probable cause she could stand behind on the servitude counts. At the bottom of the Harrowgate Road, at a pole, a 3-man co-op line crew in bucket trucks, doing a job that had been scheduled 30 days earlier and had nothing to do with anybody, and 11 miles away in a kitchen in Haverlock, a 52-year-old man and his son, sitting at a table, not saying much. Lucas had his hands wrapped in the white cotton gloves he still wore at that point. Judah had a coffee he wasn't drinking. Neither of them looked at the clock, and both of them knew exactly what time it was. At 9:02 p.m., the co-op crew opened the Harrowgate Road recloser, and 400 acres went black. In the east room they laughed, the way people do, and somebody said a joke about the country, and Bernadine went to find the candles she kept for exactly this, and Ellsworth said, without hurrying, "Carson, go start the generator." In the creamery corridor, 12 electromagnets released at once, and 12 doors moved about an inch in their frames, and the battery-backed emergency lights came up along the ceiling, cold and white, and lit the whole hall end to end. For about 11 seconds, nothing happened. Boudreau has said that those 11 seconds were the longest of her career. Then a door opened. It was room 6. Margot Tetlow came out into the corridor in a gray sweatsuit with her hand flat against the wall, and she stood there, and then she started to run, and she was screaming, and every other door in that hallway opened. Carson Bellinger was 40 yards from the generator shed with a flashlight when 4 people came out of the creamery door into the dark and went past him. He grabbed at Winston Achebe and got a handful of Shirt and Achebe, who was 58 years old and weighed 130 pounds, hit him in the face and kept going. They ran toward the only light on the property, and the only light on the property was the candles in the east room windows. Margot Tetlow came through the lodge's screen door and into the Founders' Table dinner at 9:04 in the evening on the 19th of June in front of 11 candles and 6 paying guests and 2 attorneys, and she got out 1 sentence before her legs went. She said, "Please, we're being kept." The surveillance van had audio on the east room, because the east room had been wired since Tuesday under a warrant. The recording runs 11 minutes, and it is, according to every prosecutor who has heard it, the single most damaging piece of evidence any of them has ever worked with. You can hear Sebastian Whitcomb say, very calmly, "Sit down, Margot." You can hear a guest ask what is happening. You can hear Ellsworth Bellinger say the words she is a resident, She is confused, and you can hear Bernadine Bellinger say, "Get her back in the wing." And then you can hear a woman scream that she has been in that building for 481 days, and you can hear a chair go over, and you can hear a man's voice, one of the guests, a man from Westchester who had come to talk about his brother, say, "Oh my God," and then say it again. Boudreaux gave the order at 9:06. Nobody at Harrowgate was armed and nobody fought. Ellsworth Bellinger was taken off his own porch, the same porch, and he did not say anything at all. Carson was taken in the field between the shed and the lodge. Corabelle was in the kitchen deleting a shared drive from her phone, which added 2 counts. Sebastian Whitcomb told an agent that he was counsel to several parties present and that everyone in the room should stop talking, and he was correct, and it was much too late. Serena Bellinger was found in the parking area, sitting in the driver's seat of Whitcomb's car with the door open, not going anywhere. When they told her she was under arrest, she asked whether Lucas had done this. The agent said, "No, ma'am. His father did." And Serena Bellinger put her forehead on the steering wheel. The generator came on at 9:11, 8 minutes into it, because Carson never got there, and by the time the lights came back on, it did not matter what anybody could see. Judah's phone rang at 9:41. It was Boudreaux, and all she said was, "All 4 are out, and they're all talking." Judah Kirkland put the phone face down on the table and put both hands over his eyes and did not make a sound, and his son got up and stood behind his chair and put a gloved hand on his shoulder. The federal indictment ran to 61 counts: forced labor, conspiracy to commit forced labor, involuntary servitude, document servitude for the admission forms, kidnapping for 4 counts where the initial transport crossed a state line, conspiracy against rights because Sheriff Ordell Grimsley had been paid $11,000 over 3 years to make welfare checks go away, and that made it color of law. Money laundering, through 2 shells Bernadine Bellinger had been running since 2019. Ellsworth Bellinger went to trial, because men like that always do. It took 11 days. The government's case was 3 things, in this order: 4 surviving witnesses, 11 minutes of audio from the East Room, and, for 2 full days, a 52-year-old metering contractor with a laser pointer and 140 graphs. Judah testified for 6 hours. He explained inrush current to a jury in Binghamton. He showed them the well pump at 2:40 in the morning, 51 nights in a row. He showed them the pressure washer's heartbeat at 7 a.m. in January. He showed them 11 dryer cycles a day. And then he put up one slide, a single flat line across 51 days, and said, "This is the electric baseboard heater in room 3, and it did not draw 1 watt from the 27th of December to the 28th of February, and the coldest night in that period was 11 below zero." Then he put up the photograph of the panel with the blue tape on breaker 3, dated the 19th of November, and he said, "My son labeled that himself, 8 days before they put him in that room." Yancey says the jury did not look at Ellsworth Bellinger again after that. The verdicts came back in 5 hours. Ellsworth Bellinger got 32 years. Bernadine got 19. Carson, who did the work line and the gravel and the hose, got 28. Corabelle, who signed the forms, got 14. Sebastian Whitcomb pled out at 22 years in exchange for the client list, and the client list opened 9 more investigations in 4 states, and Rutherford Tetlow is currently doing 11 years, and the man from Westchester who said "Oh my God" twice is doing 6. Sheriff Grimsley resigned in August and pled in November and got 5. Deputy Anneke Rule, who never filed that report in February and who testified for 2 hours about why, is now a sergeant. Serena Bellinger cooperated fully, from the 2nd week, against her entire family and against the man she'd been sleeping with for 2 years. It bought her 9 years instead of 20. She wrote Lucas a 14-page letter from Danbury. He read the first page, and then he put the whole thing in the shop stove, and he told his father he wasn't angry. He just didn't have anywhere to put it. Tanzy Bellinger turned 18 that October. She lives with a great-aunt in Rochester and is in her 2nd year of nursing school, and Judah pays for it, and the 2 of them have never once discussed that arrangement out loud. Lucas Kirkland's hands took 14 months. 9 of the 10 fingerprints came back, because the abrasion had mostly stayed above the dermis, which is the only mercy in the whole story and an accidental one. The right index never did. There is a smooth patch there, and there always will be. He can't unlock a phone with that hand. He uses a passcode, and when people ask, he says he writes things down. He got his journeyman card 14 months after the 19th of June. The wrist required 2 surgeries, and it aches in the cold, and he can do the work. And there is one more thing, and it happened on the porch. There was a hearing in Binghamton in the spring, some procedural thing, and afterward, Judah found himself in a corridor 8 feet from Ellsworth Bellinger, who was in a jumpsuit and cuffs and had gotten old very fast. Ellsworth looked at him and said, "You couldn't leave it alone." And Judah Kirkland, who had thought about this exact moment for a year and had never once written down what he'd say, said, "You told me he was your problem, not mine. You were right, he wasn't your problem. He was the only one in that building who had somebody. Now they're all yours." Then he went and found his son in the parking lot, and they drove home, and on the way, Lucas said the panel schedule on the new job was a disaster, and somebody was going to have to redo it, and Judah said, "Well, write it down." So that's Judah Kirkland, and I want to tell you the part that stayed with me, because it isn't the courtroom, and it isn't the night the lights went out. It's the 45-day violation notice. Think about what actually happened there. A father figured out that the fastest way to open 12 locked doors wasn't to break them. It was to go find the one government office that had the authority to make his enemy open them, and then hand that office a complaint so boring, so procedural, so completely free of emotion, that nobody in that county ever knew it was a father talking. And then Ellsworth Bellinger spent $19,000 of his own dollars unlocking his own prison, and framed the certificate. That's not luck. That's a man who understood the difference between being loud and being effective. Anger wants to be seen. Patience wants to win. Those are 2 different appetites, and you have to pick one. And here's the other thing, and it's the reason I opened the way I did. Judah didn't beat those people with strength or with money or with connections, because he had none of the 3. He beat them with a record. 11 little boxes on a wall that nobody thought about, counting 60 times a second, all winter, while everyone with power in that county told him he was imagining things. That's worth sitting with. The people who hurt you are counting on the fact that nobody was keeping track. Be the person who keeps track. Write it down. Note the date. Save the message. You may never need it, but the day you do, a plain, dull, boring record will do things for you that rage never could. Every house keeps a diary. So should you. If this one got you, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.